Welcome to Autism Australia's Ought to Know webinar series. My name's Nicole Rogerson. I'm the CEO of Autism Australia. This is a monthly webinar series that we have, but the one that you've come to today is focused on the adult years. So if you, like me, have an adult child with autism, or if you are the parent of a teenager who knows those years are coming, I hope you're with us. And there might even be some very brave parents of very little ones who are looking to the future, but I suspect most of the people in here are old like Brent and I. Before we kick off, I want to acknowledge our sponsor, Chill for Autism. Chill, our friends, they are an evidence-based social skills coaching program for young adults on the spectrum. They're based in Brisbane. It is an amazing program. I absolutely love it, run by the amazing Helen Whelan. Currently they have 450 young neurodivergent adults that attend weekly sessions at Chill and learning strengths-based curriculum, peer monitors. It's just absolutely beautiful and helps young adults grow in confidence and increasingly become socially independent. So we are so grateful for Chill. Apart from the fact we love them, it's very nice that they helped us make this webinar possible. So today I'm going to introduce an old friend of mine, but that's not why he's here, Brent Woolgar. Welcome, Brent.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Brent is actually one of Australia's leading experts in specialist disability accommodation, with over 25 years experience across accessible design, consulting and project delivery. He's a seasoned advisor to families, governments and developers alike. But Brent also brings lived experience insights here, as he is the proud father of identical twins, one of whom has cerebral palsy, and I just realized they're now both 24. So wow, I can't believe that. But Brent, thank you for joining us. It's just so fabulous to have you here.
It's a pleasure, Nick. I'm happy to be involved.
Oh, thank you. Now, for everybody listening, there are going to be questions. So put your questions in the chat and we'll come to you at some point at the end. If we've got enough time, we'll answer as many as we can. Now, Brent, the reason we've got you here to talk about housing, SDA, SIL, is because I'm going to be really honest and say I know very little about it. I'm embarrassed to say. In all the years I've been in the autism space, I hear about it, I understand it in an NDIS context, but because we haven't had to go there as a family personally, I've kind of ignored it a little bit, and I suspect lots of families in our community have, or they have a little bit of understanding about it but would like to know what the options are just in case it becomes a reality for families. Do you find that a lot of families are just pretty clueless?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's incredibly complex. Do you want me to sort of do that broad explanation?
Yeah, because here's the other thing. All of you professionals walk around saying things like SDA and SIL, and sometimes I've got to go, well, it's supported independent living versus, sometimes it's the acronyms that make it confusing for people as well.
Yeah, sure. So within the NDIS, within its massive construct, there's a section or an area of supports called home and living. And so they're very much focused on people living independently, whether that's full-time or whether it's part-time through respite, short-term accommodation, medium-term accommodation, etc. So the only form, and I'll talk about SDA first, so the only form of permanent home that the NDIS will fund is SDA, or Specialist Disability Accommodation. Now, the core criteria for SDA eligibility are two statements, and I'll put a statement out before I say what they are. These are NDIS language. So NDIS is based around a deficit model of disability. It's not particularly the language I would use, so I'm just repeating what the NDIS say. So to be eligible for SDA, you have to satisfy one or two criteria, and they are extreme functional impairment, and usually that is in 3 of the 6 fundamental functional areas of the NDIS. And then you've also got very high person-to-person support needs. So I find a lot of people, if they start going down the rabbit hole of what is SDA, they get to those two statements and go, well, my loved one doesn't really fit those, because let's face it, as a parent, you don't want to admit that your loved one has extreme functional impairment, et cetera, et cetera. And quite often for a lot of people, that's where the journey stops. So I'll just park SDA for a second. So that's just the housing component of it. Now, a person that might be eligible for SDA then gets support funding. And support funding, historically, typically within the NDIS, is supported independent living, or SIL. So the base construct of SIL is rostered support workers 24/7. People can live alone and receive SIL supports, but more typically it's in some form of shared environment. So it might be a group of townhouses or a group of co-located homes, etc., where people get some one-to-one support and they might get some shared support depending on their needs throughout the day.
And is that sometimes called a group home?
It can be, but a group home usual construct is, we think of a group home as 5 people, typically living in sort of those old government type homes, and they're slowly but surely being phased out, thank God.
Okay.
So
I'm going to have to ask you the thank God bit, right? So,
yeah,
like, for those who don't know the old group home model, what made them so shitty?
You got 5 people living together and if we rewind pre-NDIS and even today, in some instances, the 5 people living together had no say in who they were going to live with. All of their supports are delivered by rostered support workers that generally, in a lot of cases, sadly don't have much of a connection with those people. So it is like mini institutional living in some cases, and it just takes away people's choice and control about how they want to live.
Yeah, it sounds awful.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do it. I struggle to find anyone with disability, without disability, that would put their hand up and say, I'd love to go and share my home with 4 other people I've never met.
Yeah, no one's going to do that.
No.
I take it that was just done for ease of it. It almost sounds like you're parking people somewhere.
Oh, yeah. And look, if you follow the history of disability, it was a step forward, because let's face it, pre-group homes, it was institutions with hundreds of people. Okay. So it was part of that transition to where we are today. And, I'm certainly not going to criticise 30 years ago that transition took place, but we're now emerging into an era where, things are getting better in terms of housing options for people with disability.
So going back to that where I rudely interrupted, the supported independent living, it's that rostered support that comes in, and it can be 24/7. But I presume if the individuals that were in that home didn't need 24/7, there's all sorts of variations in between.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the encouraging things that's happening in the NDIS currently is a person might receive their support funding, and it will say things like, you've got X $100,000 of support funding. We've calculated it on the base of SIL. So we've looked at how many hours, of what ratios of support, etc., what type of support overnight if you need it. And we've come up with this number. But you don't have to use SIL. As long as you stay within your funding amount, you can use much more innovative options in terms of how you get your support. And that's certainly what we're doing with my son, doing a sort of a hybrid model, if you like. So there is that flexibility creeping in, but I generally find people there's not a lot of information out there about it. The NDIS sort of aren't offering up how to design all these innovative models, etc. So it's very much left to individuals to do it. And let's face it, parents of young adults, children, wherever they might be in their age journey, people with disability, we don't have a lot of spare time, because we're generally working full time. We're doing this in our spare time, and it's incredibly complex.
All right, I'm going to come back to the innovative model, because it sounds like you've solved it. So we'll all get to the end, get to the end and tell us the end of the book. But I just want to go back so people kind of understand the origins, because I guess the NDIS aren't out there going, oh, by the way, there's really cool ways you can do this. Not because they're being mean, because it's probably just not their role to do that anyway. What is the problem that SDA and SIL was trying to solve? What was the original idea behind it?
Yeah, so it was housing. Yeah, secure housing, because we all know people's, need and desire and want for secure housing, and people that have secure housing generally have better outcomes, and that's not just for people with disability, that's across society. So it was very much, SDA was very much an attempt to solve problems around secure housing long term for people, especially people at that sort of upper end of impairment. So, that extreme functional impairment, very, very high support needs. Now, in a perfect world, we do it for everyone on the NDIS, but obviously budgets only stretch so far. So it'll be, at the end of the day, I'm the number I sort of land on is around 35,000 people will be eligible for SDA out of the NDIS cohort. We're currently sitting at about 24,000 people that have got eligibility. So there's quite a few people out there that haven't tested eligibility yet. And I generally find the vast majority of those people do it from a position of just not being aware of what might be possible.
Yeah, and I hope we're reaching some of those people today. So
Yep.
I think, Brent, the question there is eligibility. So, I know that you're in the CP world, we're in the autism world, but there's a spectrum as well, right, in terms of needs. So just because you're an autistic adult doesn't necessarily mean that SDA and SIL will be appropriate for you. I take it there's an eligibility, there's criteria, because some parents might be thinking, oh, I don't really know. You kind of can understand it for those with more profound autism. With aging parents, those parents are pretty aware they're probably eligible, and that might be something they need to consider. But there's a whole chunk of people with autism in the middle there. What's the line? Who decides eligibility?
Okay, so the general eligibility process, it starts with a home and living application to the NDIS. Now, there is a form called the supporting evidence form. And it's funny because when I think of a form, I think of a page or two. This form is 17 pages long, and it asks you to attach a whole bunch of information. So the first point I want to make there is if you are considering going on this journey and you don't have funding in the plan for all of the reports and all it asks for, you can ask for that funding up front to then go and get all the assessments and get these reports written. It generally falls under a type of funding called exploration and design. So that's just a tip. If you're thinking,
that's good to know, because I imagine there's quite a few thousands of dollars worth of assessments and reports and stuff that needs. That's
absolutely
okay.
So the application generally looks at so SDA eligibility, and you need to satisfy extreme functional impairment and or very high person-to-person support needs. Now, extreme functional impairment, that's relatively, that's more of a scientific equation to solve around your functional capacity assessments, et cetera, et cetera. When you get to very high support needs, that's one where it's a little bit more grey and where you've got more room to move. And one of the categories that they look at there are informal support networks at risk in the short term of not being sustainable. And I've seen a lot of people, autistic adults, young autistic adults, receiving SDA funding based on that criteria, that without this, it's quite likely informal carers will not be around much longer or not able to provide the support much longer, and then this person's at risk of homelessness or worse.
Right. And are they good at recognising, does age become a play here in that, I'm imagining it's really different if you're the parent of an adult like us and we're still in our middle age, but thinking of parents who are aging in their 70s and 80s, is there some kind of priority that goes there?
There can be. And it really does come down to the quality of those reports, the quality of the information that you provide to the NDIS that outlines your situation. No two situations are the same, but you've got to really outline what your situation is, why you think SDA eligibility is possible for this particular person. Not everyone, as I said, 34,000 out of 700,000 people are likely to be eligible. So eligibility is a tough test, but I still think there are a lot of people out there that don't test it because they just don't think it's possible. And I would even take it to that first step of reaching out to someone and just say, look, just at a high level, do you think it's worth us exploring this? And nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Yeah, and I can see from some of the questions that are coming through the Q&A at the moment, some people are sort of saying, look, my son would like to. I've got a lot of sons here at the moment. I don't have any daughters, so I'm not being gender specific. These are just my questions coming in. My son would like to live on his own, but he needs support. That there's a big difference between needing some support, having scaffolding around a person to make sure that's successful. It's quite a different thing from SDA to SIL, yeah?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, so the SDA is the bricks and mortar. So there's various styles of housing, apartments, townhouses, small homes, group homes. So there are, I believe it's still group homes under SDA. And then across those different homes, there are 4 categories of design. And I don't want to get too technical here, typically what we'd find for people with autism, there are two sort of design categories at SDA called improved livability or robust. They tend to be the ones where most people with autism as a primary diagnosis sit. So that's the bricks and mortar. Then there's the support funding, the SIL funding, which covers off how many hours per day has the NDIS determined is reasonable and necessary for you to have one-to-one support? How many hours a day do you have a ratioed support? So let's say, for example, a person living on their own in a one-bedroom townhouse in a group of 6, and there's support workers on site, but at one stage during the day, it might be one support worker because everyone's relatively happy doing their own thing. So that supports a 1-to-6 ratio. Other times of the day, there might be 6 support workers there working with each person individually on a 1-to-1 ratio. Then you go to overnight, there might be one person on a sleepover or an active shift overnight, again, that each person contributes to roughly on a 1-to-6 basis, depending on sort of how it all fits together. So even just speaking that, I know that for me, it's like second nature because I've been through this with my son, etc., and helped a lot of families navigate it. But it's complicated to actually get all that working. But once it's working, it does work.
So do they ever try and muck around with that funding, the support funding? Because I'm hearing the bricks and mortar part, right? So say you solve one part of it. Then you come in and say, my child needs this amount of support. Now, we all know our kids change over the years and their support needs may change going higher or lower. Does the NDIS get up in the grill there, or do they say, look, I appreciate, we think this is how you're going to be. We'll talk to you again in 5 years?
A bit of both, to be honest. And a lot of it depends on the quality of the evidence that's provided. So if you can provide really quality evidence that really explains the support needs of this particular person, the NDIS tend to be relatively good about maintaining that funding. Obviously, they have a capacity building focus for that person to try to gain capacity within, reasonable limits for them to live in more independently. But they're generally okay. It's the ones where the evidence to begin with was a little bit sketchy.
So I'm going to ask, what makes good evidence in Brent's world? It's because I'm having flashbacks of the CEO of the NDIS saying, we don't have time to read your reports. That's unfortunately scarred me for some time. What's good evidence? What helps get one of these setups? And by the way, I'm coming back to talk about exactly how you've done it because I want to get to the juicy stuff. But what is good evidence that helps you be in a position to be able to pull that together?
Right. So the home and living supporting evidence form is a good sort of guide as to what information the NDIS are looking at. What I often see, and again, this is not a criticism because families are busy, they have other things in their lives, etc., etc. They'll go out over the space of 6 to 12 months and gather all these specialist reports to help that home and living application. But let's say, for example, the psychologist report says that at this particular stage of the day, whatever it might be, person must have one-to-one support for their own safety or safety of others, for example. Go to the OT report, and the OT report says, this particular time of day, the person could probably have 1 to 2. So one support worker looking after 2 people. As soon as there's those inconsistencies, I'm sure the NDIS have AI or something doing a lot of scanning through these documents, and they will go to the 1 to 2. Because it's half the cost of the 1-to-1. They'll do it. So making sure your evidence is just absolutely watertight. And what I generally tell families, spend the time to get that very first submission right. Don't rush it because it's much easier to spend an extra 3 months making sure it's all correct, having the time to read through it, going back to those professionals and saying, I want you to amend this, I want you to change that. Because as soon as you lodge it, and it gets rejected or you don't get the outcome you wanted, 12 months, 24 months through reviews, ART, etc., to challenge the decision. So invest the time up front.
And you've already given us the tip that time can get funded, that the expense of pulling that all together and those assessments, there's funding for that. So
absolutely,
it's even more worth your while to get it right.
Yep, absolutely. And I live in a big city. well, not that big, Brisbane, but I live in a city. So therapists, advisors, etc., are relatively easy to come by. If you move out to regional and remote, we're taught multiply those time frames a lot to access the right people, to get the right information. I completely understand, and recent changes to pricing is probably not going to help, but it is more of a challenge if you fit into those regional or remote locations. So my advice in that case is start earlier. If you've got a child that's 16, start now. If that's your journey. If you want you're happy for that person to live with you until they're 30, no, don't start now. It's too early. But if you want them to move out when they're 23, 24, 16, 18, it's probably not a bad age to start, at least plotting out the journey.
And it sounds like that form is a really good place to start. It sounds like the form kind of informs your thinking about it.
Absolutely. It really does give you insight into what they consider when they're making these decisions. So
we'll put a link to that form on the YouTube, where this video will eventually, on the Autism Awareness Australia's YouTube, we'll put a link to that form, because I can't find it now and talk to Brent at the same time. But we'll find it and then we'll make sure it's there. So anyone watching this, there should be a link there.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really helpful to get people in the right headspace. And it sounds like starting a little bit earlier to investigate whether this is something for you. Now, you are a specialist in it, and you do have a son or sons that are now 24. When did you start? And okay, you had the world's biggest heads up because you work in the space. So that means, the gardener's always going to have the best lawn in the street. How did your particular family go about addressing this?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, sat down with my son and said, look, what are you thinking about your future? And we had that conversation around the time he was finishing school. So he just turned 18. He has CP, as you've mentioned. He has a significant intellectual impairment, and he also has nocturnal epilepsy. So some interesting factors to deal with. And as if I put my dad hat on, some absolutely scary shit about how is my son with nocturnal epilepsy going to survive if I'm not there taking care of him if he has a seizure overnight? And I'm sure every parent has that same feeling. So that started with some education. So an initial conversation, and then some education, some stuff that he could get his head around what was possible, etc. And that first process of him sort of landing at a place where he thought that might be okay, that took a couple of years. Now, he has an identical twin brother without disability. And it was quite interesting. We were having a conversation one night over dinner, and I said, so Nate, you're thinking about what the future might hold, when you might want to live independently, etc. And he just looked at his brother and said, when he does. And I thought, that's gold. Why should his life be any different to his brother just because he has disability? So that was good. So as that turned out, that was around 23, 24 as we speak. So he is living independently for most of the week now in a really cool environment.
And is he near you? So he's sort of physically near your neighborhood, and he can come and go?
Yeah. So he, in a straight line from our home to his home, is about 900 meters. And again, that was one of his criteria. It wasn't mine. So we've got a decision support group around him, and I purposely extracted myself from that group because I can be quite overbearing. So I just wanted to sit.
And you'd be a bit hurt if he said, I'd really like to be on the other side of town away from my annoying father.
Guess what he came up with just 2 weeks ago? There's some beautiful new SDA that's one street away from the beach at Broadbeach on the Gold Coast. He's just like,
nothing wrong with that boy's thinking.
What can I say? I'd love to do it. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Now, somebody's asked a question. Can any of this be considered for children under 18? I take it that's obviously looking, at a case that's pretty tricky.
Yeah. So, and again, I'll put the precursor out there around my language. In extreme circumstances. So when I say extreme, these would be people that have really high behaviour support, really complex behaviour support needs, risk of homelessness, potentially even a history of homelessness and or not being able to sustain tenancies. So usually due to individual interactions with other residents or property damage or both, etc., etc. So the last time the NDIS published information, and this is going back about 4 years ago, there were 217 people under the age of 18 with SDA funding.
Oh, wow.
Now, I do pro bono work with another guy based in Brisbane. Greg Barry is his name. If you want to look him up, he's an SDA eligibility expert. I really recommend Greg very highly.
Greg's number's going to get called today.
Yeah. So Greg, his latest numbers, because he helps a lot of families with people under 18 get that eligibility, around 400 people under the age of 18 have SDA. So whilst the rule generally says you have to be 18 to start, it's not necessarily the case in really, really extreme complex situations. Having someone like Greg in your corner could make or break the difference. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Greg. There's no ringing of bells in terms of sponsorships or whatever.
I'm wondering whether Greg's going to kill you after this, but okay, will. Sure.
So Greg's another dad. Greg used to be a lawyer. He did some property development work. He also has a profoundly disabled daughter around the same age as my son. So Greg and I met many, many years ago. We're on completely different journeys, and we've just managed to come back together professionally in terms of referring people and helping people over the NDIS journey. So yeah, if you're in that situation, he's worth a conversation with.
There are so many questions, Brent. I'm a bit overwhelmed by them, actually. I'm trying to do a good job of listening to you and looking at the questions, but you're answering a lot as we go. I mean, special shout out, Bindi saying it's so ridiculously difficult in regional areas, and
yep.
I feel that because when we're in cities and you're talking about models being whether they be a townhouse or an apartment, or can you explain is it 10-to-1 planning housing? Can you explain what that is?
In the apartments?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this was pioneered primarily by Summer Foundation years ago. So they would buy 10 apartments in a building. They'd buy an 11th apartment, which would be for the overnight support. And then in those 10 apartments, there would be an individual with disability living in each of those apartments. So it became known as the concierge model. So each of the people living there could have their own one-to-one supports. And then when they needed just ad hoc support throughout the day, there would be a person there 24/7, funded jointly by each of the 10 people that was kind of on call for support. So during the day, it might be just ad hoc, and then that person generally on call overnight. I will say, however, that in the SDA sort of matrix of what types of accommodation and what design categories, you can't have apartments in robust.
Okay.
And this was designed purely because people generally eligible for robust have the more higher behaviour support needs. And rightly or wrongly, the NDIS made the decision that they're probably not appropriate in that high density model. It's just not going to be successful.
Well, 1 to 10 in itself, if the needs are what you sort of referred to as extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What happens, couple of final ones, what happens if a family and an individual land on a situation that they think it's going to work, the house is where the person wants to be, it ticks a whole lot of boxes, but we're there 3-4 months in and actually it's not the right team, the person with disability is really unhappy, and how hard is it to change? Because if it just took all that long to get all of that together.
Yeah. So look, I will answer that question and bring me back on track if I head off on a tangent. You know what I'm like. The first thing is, and I think this is really appropriate for everyone that's going on that living independent journey, whether it's SDA or not SDA, take your time, do the right planning. I see so many families that kind of know this is coming and just don't want to know about it. And it gets to a point of crisis and then everything is rushed. And that's when you tend to get the poorer outcomes, unsustainable outcomes. So if you take your time, and again, this is what I've done with my son, used some funding flexibly for him to go and live in a 3-bedroom house with 2 other people for a couple of weeks, to live in an apartment on his own for a couple of weeks, try some different types of living, try some different types of support models, figure out what might work for him. You know, I often thought he would want to live in a shared environment. I really did think he'd want to share with some people. He doesn't. He wants to live on his own. He actually likes the solitude. Now, I wouldn't have picked that, but that's sort of the path that he wants. He's now living on his own in an apartment, but there are some other people in the same complex. So if he wants that interaction, he can go get it. But if he doesn't, he doesn't have this person wandering out of their bedroom, you know, annoying him.
Yeah, fair call. I think I'm with Nate.
Yeah.
Final question, which veers a little bit into the politics, I guess, for it is, you know, you don't have to be watching Australian politics very closely to know the NDIS gets a pretty bad rap for being an expensive runaway train of costs. Is the SDA SIL model sustainable? I mean, it to me, it just feels like this is the core thing that the NDIS was always supposed to be about. But I mean,
Yeah.
is there going to be any silly nonsense in terms of how this is treated going forward into the future?
Well, I'd say SDA is safer than SIL. I don't think anything within the NDIS is 100% safe. But if you look at the original estimates, SDA was about 700 million out of what was then thought to be 22 million, I think it was. So it was a really small piece of the overall puzzle. It's kind of remained like that. It hasn't even hit the 700 million mark yet.
Okay.
So I think from a cost reduction perspective, it's pretty safe. It's not sort of the beaming issue.
Yep.
Still is the beaming issue. Like there's $14 billion, almost, you know, what's that? 2/3 of the original entire NDIS budget is now committed just in SIL. Now, SIL still didn't exist. If you go back to 2013, 14, in the original design, productivity commission stuff, SIL was never mentioned. SIL was this plane built in flight after the NDIS was launched, going, we need to come up with a mechanism to be able to get the old block funded model, to be able to distribute it to individuals living in this house so that we can fit it within the NDIS model. So I sort of tongue in cheek say, well, the work experience kid built that spreadsheet that underpinned the entire SIL model. And for years, providers were filling out that model on behalf of people saying this person needs $700,000 of funding, submitting it, the NDIS going, okay, and funding it. Where in reality, that person probably only needed 300. Because it was driven so much by the providers, a lot of those providers transitioning out of the block funded model, they didn't want to get away with their 5 levels of management and their company cars and, you know, conferences at the golf club and all this sort of stuff. They wanted to maintain the old block funded model. Whereas now, you know, the NDIS is completely different. It's a highly commercial, profit-making for providers enterprise. A lot of providers haven't got there yet. And we're definitely seeing the NDIS, I'd say definitely at a point of frustration going, we've given them the tools, we've given them enough warning that we need you to, you know, become more commercial, more streamlined, etc. And you're not doing it. So now we're going to force it. And unfortunately, they're forcing it through individual funding reduction. So to answer your question, SDA relatively safe. Support funding, definitely not as safe. And we've seen over the last 3 years in particular, a lot of people have reductions in that funding.
Yeah.
So it's a big deal.
You and I were recently at a conference with a lot of service providers that were all walking around looking pretty hangdog, and they're those two sort of competing things with them all holding their hands up crying poor. But ultimately, you know, families need to make sure that their loved ones have the right level of support that they need over a long period of time, because most parents think about the time when they're not going to be here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you've got to, and that's why, again, I say take your time. Don't build a model that spends up to every single cent that the person's been allocated in funding, and really focus on the capacity building. Because I do see, and I'm not bashing providers, there are a lot of really good providers out there. but there are some that would just take that person into a vacancy they had in a home, take all their funding with absolutely no thought whatsoever about how can we help this person gain capacity to be more independent. And I'm not talking about cooking 5-star Michelin meals. I'm talking about really basic, small steps, but at least having a plan over 5 years that we're going to take this person to be able to select their clothing, do their personal cares, still maybe needed to be prompted for various things, etc. But a lot of them don't even have that. So it all feeds back to that real need to really map the journey out, and don't rush it. Don't leave it until it's a crisis, because you will rush it and chances are you'll get an outcome that's not sustainable.
Brent, that's very good advice. I can't thank you enough. I do need you to know, though, I've never had so many questions in the Q&A as I have on this particular webinar. So I feel like there's a chance that if I buy you a glass of wine, can I convince you to come back for round 2?
Yeah, for sure.
I'll keep all these questions. So for people listening, we'll keep them all. Trust me, they haven't gone into the ether. Some of you are asking really specific stuff. And what I might do is send them to Brent and then get him to jump onto another one where we can go. Lots of people asking questions about how they could possibly use their own homes and their own situations. And I suspect you've got a few answers there too. So
yeah, definitely.
I really appreciate you giving us your time
Yep.
and really hope your mate is okay with how many people are going to be calling him today.
Yeah, I'll give him the heads up, and
yeah. By the way, it wasn't me. By the way, it wasn't.
He won't mind.
Yeah, I'm sure. Poor bastard. Okay, Brent, I love you. Thank you very much for this generous,
Pleasure.
as per usual, in giving us your brain and your input. For those who are watching this, if you've registered for this particular webinar, we'll send you the video. So you'll get it if you want to forward it to a partner or another parent or someone else in the family who might find it interesting. It'll come to you in the next couple of days. Give us time to get it all together. And then that goes and lives on Autism Awareness Australia's YouTube channel too. So you can come back and look at it if you're thinking, I can't quite bear to think about this yet, but I'll think about it in a few months' time. It is going to be there along on the Autism Awareness website where we've got everything. Thank you very much to our friends Chill for Autism. Also in Brizzy, it's an all Queensland Day today. Brent, I love you. Thank you very much. And
it's a pleasure
for joining us.
And look, Nick, I will, if you do want to have me back to delve into those questions, yes, please do send them through. I'll sort of categorize them and have some answers. And I'm more than happy to come back and do another session where we go through those responses.
You're an angel. Thank you, Brent.
No worries. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.